Thank you so much, Emily, for being here. I'm super excited to talk with you. I've loved your books over the years. I first met you through the written word, I believe. Yeah. Yes. And sort of reading your books and loving them. And so it's great to have you here to chat. And for those who don't know who you are, who need a refresher, I just want to read a little bit about who you are. Emily Freeman is a best-selling author and popular blogger and speaker who for nearly 10 years has been writing on the internet. She graduated from Columbia International University and the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where she received her degree in educational interpreting for the deaf. She then became a sign language interpreter for several years before starting a family and starting a blog. So Emily is the author of 4 books, several of which I've just absolutely loved like crazy, and a couple of which have become super bestsellers. Grace for the Good Girl, Graceful for Young Women, A Million Little Ways, and her most recent release, Simply Tuesday, Small Moment Living in a Fast-Moving World. So thank you so much for joining, Emily. And where are you today on this fine day in your lovely space?
Yeah, so I am in Greensboro, North Carolina. So this is where I came here for college, and I was going to leave after school. And now it's been 18 years.
That happens, right?
Yep. It does. It really does.
Much to the chagrin of many of the parents out there, right? You say your kids just go off for 4 years and then they end up living their lives there.
Right.
So do you think you could give us kind of a little bit, what we're really going to be talking about right now is sort of purpose and kind of how you found yours and maybe how you're still finding yours. And I know you, particularly in the past year, have done a lot of writing on that topic as it relates to kind of not just you, but also your husband and sort of you as a family finding purpose. So I'd love if you could just sort of give some, just kind of a more of an intro, more flavor into who you are and you know, what you're about as it relates to this idea.
Sure. Well, I think I grew up sort of having the the movie Runaway Bride, Maggie Carpenter, who she kept leaving men at the altar. That is not my story.
My best friend's mother wrote that movie.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then you know all about. I feel like I had sort of a Maggie Carpenter syndrome. Not that I left men at the altar, but that I took a long time to figure out who I am and what I like and dislike. And I call it the good girl syndrome of just sort of like going along with the flow. And so because of that, I think for me and people like me, I think it's a little more difficult to sort of hone in on what it is that makes us come most fully alive. And that has really been the thread for me of discovering and uncovering my purpose is really paying attention. And Parker Palmer calls it listening to your life. And that's been so powerful for me in my own life of paying attention to what makes me come most fully alive. Because the truth is, I don't know that I believe that people are necessarily called to write a book or called to become a speaker or called to certain things. I guess, I do feel like I'm called to motherhood and things like that because that's what I do and that's what I am. But I do believe we're all called to become more fully ourselves. And if writing books or if speaking or if painting or if accounting helps you become more fully yourself, then by golly, that's what we're called to do. And so that has been really powerful for me in understanding my purpose is really listening to my life and paying attention to what makes me come alive.
So do you think you have always known what makes you come alive? Or, well, 2 questions. First, do you think you've always known what makes you come alive?
No, I don't. I think I've always known maybe in the hidden part of my soul. Because I think we all kind of recognize times when we feel like, oh, I really feel like myself doing this. But I don't think I've always had the courage to admit it. When I got married, I wrote all my life, sort of in journals and stories and different things. But once I got married, I sort of thought writing was it's just a little hobby. That's just something I did for fun. That was like a schoolgirl thing. And now I need to be a grown-up and do things that grown-ups do. And I had this really weird sense of like, if you're a grown-up, you have to have this job that you maybe don't love.
Right.
I don't know where we get that or where I got that, but so I think that I knew that I loved writing, but it wasn't until I had we have twin girls who are now 12, but maybe it was a year after they were born, I realized like, I am a shadow of myself. I am walking around like a shadow woman. And it was crazy. And Claire, that was when I started writing again, because not to like, I'm going to write a book, but just because like, I felt like I didn't exist. And writing helped to ground me and helped to convince me, like, oh, you're here. This is your life. And writing sort of helped me know what I thought about my life. And that was sort of where I began to pay attention, like, oh, I'm becoming myself now. And that was really powerful for me.
Wow. So do you think writing is your purpose, or do you think your purpose is something different? Because I mean, some people think that purpose is about, sometimes people think that purpose is sort of a idea of, how you can reach people or how you can act in the world. But then some people think of purpose as more about sort of the act of what you do. So I'm curious.
It's a great question. And, it's funny because just recently I feel like I have sort of woken up to a new way that I feel like I come alive, which is teaching. For many years, I've not in a school, but I feel like that I have seen my vocation a certain way. It looks a certain way. And then I did a few things of teaching that I didn't really expect. And afterwards, I'm like, oh, that felt like me. And so to say, I don't know that I would say writing or teaching is my purpose, but I do think purpose is all wound up in becoming more fully myself. And as I become more fully myself, how might I then be able to offer myself to others and help them become more fully themselves? And that resonates with me when you say the word purpose. And so that could manifest itself through writing or through teaching or just through a conversation with a friend. But I feel like that's a deeper sense of something that's sort of like an arrow forward, and it might show itself differently throughout my life, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how do you typically do that with people? How do you typically help people sort of be more fully them?
I am a big proponent of asking questions, curious questions. I think that I have been in the past, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years, learning the importance and the power of listening. I don't think we know how to listen. I think I used to think I was a good listener, but really I was I was a patient waiter to say what I wanted to say. Like I was really good at waiting till I could have my turn to talk. And so Adam McHugh's book, actually, what's his book? The Listening Life. Oh, he talks a lot about different ways of listening and how we often think that we're good listeners, but then he has like 20 different ways of listening that aren't great ways of listening that we often think are. And so just all that to say, I feel like that there's a lot of, sometimes do you ever know when you're with someone and you have an issue and you need to work it out and you go to them and you talk to them, and if they listen to you, you can walk away from that conversation and be like, that was so helpful. Thank you so much. And the person's like, I didn't do anything. So I think there's great power. And I think our true selves often come out when we're in the presence of someone who's willing to listen and isn't trying to fix us, and someone who doesn't have an agenda. And so I think approaching relationships, whether it be intentionally or just like in my family or just in a daily life, approaching relationships with an open hand and without an agenda is a really powerful start to helping people uncover for themselves who they most fully are. And that really makes my tail wag. I love that.
And it's a very unusual thing, and it's a very powerful thing. So I read, I think it was in an article or a post you wrote, this idea, you had sort of this question, do you desperately fear you have nothing to offer the world, but secretly hope you're wrong? And I read that and I was just like, wow. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think that, I think we have this idea, or at least I've had this idea growing up, that sort of there's this one thing we're made to do, and our job in life is to sort of uncover our one thing. And often Pinterest, in the culture sort of confirms that. But I don't know that I necessarily think that's true. Maybe some people have one thing, but I believe that there's not just one way that I'm made to interact with the world and to be myself, but there are actually a million little ways that I might that I am one person, but there are a million little ways that I might show myself in the world and sort of relate with the world in a way that's true and real and authentic. And so I've often, with this work, I write books, and mostly women read the books, although not all, some men read. But in talking with women, I feel like a lot of the conversation often goes to sort of like, well, I don't know my thing, or I don't have a thing. People think you have to have a thing. And I think that we're doing ourselves a disservice to define purpose or to define what we have to offer as just one thing. Because as we become fully ourselves, and over time, sort of in different seasons of life, that's going to look really different. I was at a conference once where afterward, I sort of gave a talk, and then afterwards they did this Q&A sort of off the cuff, and they were asking me about my next book, which was A Million Little Ways, the book I wrote about creativity and life with Christ. And so I was telling them about the book, and she's like, "What's it about?" And I don't know about you, but sometimes when you talk with authors about their books, we don't know what to say. Our book is like, I don't know. It's like the hardest, right? I just write about stuff, and there's words, and it's nonfiction. Like, no one cares.
All the words.
All the words. What they really want to know is what's in it for me. And so when she asked me, "What's your book about?" I remembered I need to tell them what's in it for them. And so what came out of my mouth was, well, it's really a book for anyone who desperately fears they have nothing to offer, but secretly hopes she's wrong. And
then she ran to the bookstore and bought 10 of them.
Every woman in the room starts and this is what they did, which was interesting. They started pointing at one another. And they started being like, "That's you, that's you." And I could tell they had conversations with each other, and they recognized not really themselves in me saying that, but their friends. And so I feel like oftentimes we can see in others what they have to offer more quickly than we can see it in ourselves. And so after that conference, I wrote that down, I got to use that because it resonated. And so I think that's a really powerful thing. In the listening conversation and coming without an agenda is what a beautiful thing to have others who we love be able to recognize what they have to offer the world and come to it in your presence. What a gift to be able to have a front row seat to that.
That's so interesting. And it reminds me so much I was speaking with Mary DeMuth earlier this week, and she was talking about a mastermind she has. It's a bunch of sort of authors that get together, and they have, I think it's weekly online and then once a year as a retreat. And at their last retreat, someone said something, this idea, and I'm not remembering who it was, said basically that, we're all sort of like salad dressing, and we don't really understand the various things that make us who we are and that make us so good and tasty and exciting. And so it was sort of in the retreat that their job was to figure out what their partner's salad dressing mix was. I mean, it's essentially the same idea of basically, if I were to sit with you and I would say, "Emily, these are your strengths," and you would say to me, "Claire, these are your strengths." And it's such a powerful thing to do, and it's so unusual, and I'm sure super, super transforming for people. So do you feel like you help people do this now through your books, through online courses? What do you typically do to reach people right now?
I hope so. I hope I'm doing that. Yes, through I've been writing on the internet on a blog for 10 years.
I love how you say that on your bio. I've been writing on the internet.
I have been quietly in my little quiet corner. And the whole purpose of what I do there and everything that I write there goes through the filter of helping you create space for your soul to breathe. Because I feel like we don't know what that looks like and what that means. And so that's sort of the whole purpose of the blog writing. And then the books sort of take that deeper and in different iterations of that. It all kind of goes through that. But then, I have one with creativity and hoping to poke awake people's soul to recognize I'm here and I have something unique to offer. So that is through books and internet writing. And then I've recently been just kind of playing around with a group mentorship that I call the Artist Bench. And there's just nine women and me sitting on a bench. I like to talk about a bench because I feel like that's rather than maybe a platform, although nothing wrong with it. It's kind of the same thing. But in my head, it helps me think small groups where I can listen and be listened to and heard. That's kind of my jam. And so I've sort of developed this artist bench where I've been walking with a group of 9 women for the past 3 weeks. It's a 5-week kind of format. And so I've loved that. And I think some of that is where that teaching element has sort of woken up in me. And so that's been a really transformative process for me, but also for them. And that's so rewarding to see. So those are probably the main ways. I also have a membership site for writers that I've co-founded with my family and then our friend Brian. And that has been, because I love talking with writers about writing, but my blog is not really the place to do it. And so just kind of building a new bench for just writers has been really powerful for me and super fun. And so that's kind of the different areas these days where I've been hanging out.
That's really awesome. I love the idea of a bench, right? We talk about platforms and megaphones and all that kind of thing, but the idea of just sort of folks coming together. And I think as a woman with a small child and that sort of thing, I think also bench just sort of resonates in my soul also, because it feels like I'm on benches most
a lot
or something.
right.
So I want to ask you about something I was reading, an article on your site about this idea of the what now moment you talked about. And it came from an Ann Patchett book. And I love Ann Patchett. And I realized I hadn't read this book. And so I immediately went out and ordered it, and I haven't gotten it yet or whatever, because I live in Argentina, and the worst part of living in Argentina is not having Amazon Prime. But so there's this quote that you reference that Ann Patchett says, and I just wondered if you sort of talk through this idea. And the quote is, "Sometimes the circumstances at hand force us to be braver than we actually are. And so we knock on doors and ask for assistance, sometimes not having any idea where we're going, and that it works out better than we could possibly have imagined." Can you just tell me a bit about this idea of your what now moment and how this sparked?
Well, that book, it's funny. I just ran across it at the library. It's a tiny little book. So when you do get to it, it will be a quick read. But it was actually her commencement speech that she gave. Oh, okay. And so it sort of it reads, well, like you can talk through it. But the reason I even picked the book up was because of the title, What Now? And at the time when I saw it in the library, my husband, John, and I were in the midst of a really huge what now moment, which was he had been a youth pastor at a church for 12 years. And he was sort of, we had just gone through a lot of grief over the loss of his dad. His dad died of lung cancer. And there's something about grief that I've discovered that I feel like grief lives really close to passion and heart. And it's like when you access the grief, then you can also sort of access what it is that makes you come alive. And my husband, John, had never really been able to answer the question, if you could do anything, that question we ask ourselves sometimes, if it wasn't for money or anything, what would you do? He couldn't answer the question, Claire. Wow. And we could never put our finger on why. And it kind of made me crazy, because I'm like, I can sort of dream and think and cast vision. But he was never able to do that. And so it wasn't only after his dad passed away that he had to access that grief, which also led him to access his true heart. And so we walked together through that. And what happened was, I really think that it poked his soul awake. And he sort of realized, life is not forever. And I want to be being fully myself in my vocation, if I can. And so through a process of lots of financial digging and lots of conversation and prayer and advice from friends and mentors, we decided to take the step for him to leave youth ministry, which, he has his master's in divinity in pastoral studies. Like, he's studied to be a pastor. This was his work, but to leave youth ministry. But the thing is we didn't really know what he was stepping into. Mm-hmm. So I would not necessarily recommend quit your job without having one lined up. Right. That is not the moral of the story. But that's what happened. That was our story. And so I'm in the library and I see this book, What Now? And I'm like, yes, please, because that is our whole, I just felt like that whole year was one big question mark. But through a series of, it ended up to where he ended up sort of stepping into a role of a director of a nonprofit here locally in town. And he's still, we often say he had to leave the church so that he could pastor because a lot of the work in the church was very structured and it was a lovely place, but it was just super busy. Mm-hmm. So now he sort of has his own way that he can minister. But it was during that time when we had to ask ourselves some really tough questions. And because when you go to school for something and you have this plan, it's really hard to step out of that and walk into something that's just a big question mark. But I often think a lot of life and even growing up is stepping into the fog and trusting that you're not going to go over a cliff, which that's the scary part. It really is scary, especially, I remember telling John, like, I wish that you were just a bank teller, because everybody knows what a banker is. Like, what does your husband do? He works at a bank. End of conversation. But instead, we have to be people who are so like driven by a deep sense of purpose. And, like we have, not that you don't have purpose if you're work at a bank, but it's so easy to explain. And sometimes I feel like what we do is not so easy to explain. And so that what now moment, that's our most recent one. It was really tied up in sort of his vocation. But I feel like we were able to, when we couldn't turn towards a sure job or sure next steps, we were then asked to turn towards one another. And it was really strengthening for our marriage, what could have potentially been super stressful for our marriage.
Absolutely.
It just so happened that it brought us closer together. For us, that was the only choice. And I think that we have come out sort of on the other side of it at this point, stronger for that question mark. And so question marks often lead to really lovely things, but it's hard because you can't plan them out. And that can be really scary.
So this is connected, I guess, to another article I read you wrote called with this idea of the arrow to nowhere and what the arrow to nowhere really is. And you have this line that I thought was just fantastic, where you said, sometimes it looks like you're going nowhere or that you're headed in the wrong direction, but maybe none of that is the point. And that's just so powerful.
I think we're so trained to sort of like, we see those arrows and we think of maps and we're going from this place to the next place. And we just think that's sort of the point, but really, because that's what you can see and measure. But what I'm learning is there's a lot of power in the transformation that takes place on the inside, and that doesn't happen in a hurry. And so that is what I'm learning, and that's such a hard thing to learn, because the soul just works at a speed that my body doesn't want to go. But I think that that's a place where settling down into that, it can be really spiritually transformative and powerful, and super frustrating at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, so much of, what's the hashtag, the struggle is real or something?
Yes.
It is. So I wonder, as we have sort of a few minutes left, I'm wondering if you could sort of maybe thinking back to, or maybe calling upon what you sort of tell folks that, sit on your artist bench with you. But if you were to sort of give folks one idea or one sort of takeaway about how they could better think about clarifying their purpose, is there something that comes to mind? Either, something you recommend others have done, something you and your husband, John, have done in the past year and a half, or something that comes to mind?
Well, two things come to mind. One is to not be afraid of the silence. I think I often avoid it because I'm afraid. I'm not even afraid of what I'll hear. I'm afraid I won't hear anything. Like when you get silent. It's like, what if nothing? So I get silent, nothing happens. Now what? And there's a big another now what now moment. So that's one thing. And another thing that John and I did do during that question mark time was we sort of enlisted a group of people we called our co-listeners. And their job was to they came to our house, we gave them coffee and pie, and we just asked if they would be willing to sit and listen to us say words. We didn't have an agenda. We were just like, we have these passions, and they feel disconnected. They felt all disconnected. But they were just people that we loved and respected. And most of them were older than us, honestly. A few were peers, but, and they came and they drank our coffee and they listened. And it was through meeting with them, maybe just twice even over the period of several months, that next steps became clear over time, because you sometimes don't know what you don't know, and you can't see it yourself because you're sort of so close to it. And so that group of co-listeners we point back to and say, that was so key in what our next step ended up being. But we wouldn't have known that at the time. But we just knew we value conversation. We value these people. Let's get it all in one room and see what happens.
Where did you come up with that idea?
I don't know. I think just knowing how John and I are, I'm more introverted, he's more extroverted, but we're both kind of in the middle. So we definitely value sort of, we get energy from being alone and thinking through, but sometimes we just definitely need that interactive, collaborative thing. And John we live in our town, and he's been here. He was born here. So he's lived his whole life here except for college. And so he's developed a lot of relationships that go deep. And that's the other thing is people who know us well, like wouldn't have worked if they didn't know us super well.
Right.
But it also felt a little risky because they knew us well, but they didn't all know us super well. They weren't our BFFs, you know? And so it was like, oh, do we really want to let people into this? You know, it felt like a risk. It felt like it felt pretty vulnerable. And like, maybe they're going to think we're crazy. Maybe they're going to all come and say, John, you should not quit your job. That's ridiculous. You're making a big mistake. And, you know, that's a risk too, because you already kind of feel like you want to do this thing. And if they say something completely different, you're sort of opening yourself up to that. But wow. And that was that was one of those sort of cliff moments, walking into the fog, like we don't know what's going to happen here, but we can't do this alone. And so and that again was part of that transformation of, I'm going to practice the spiritual discipline of letting people in. That was a big deal for us. But that ended up being a real turning point. So I don't know where the idea first came from, except just knowing we've sort of gone as far as we can go on our own.
That's a really, really powerful idea.
Yeah.
Wow. So where can tell us where people can find more about you and read more of your words?
Oh, yeah. Well, I am on the internet at emilypfreeman.com. There's another Emily Freeman. So there's two of us. So I have a P, and that's kind of where everything lives. That's where you can find the books. And I'm Emily P. Freeman on Twitter and on Instagram. Instagram is my favorite, honestly. That's kind of where I hang out a lot. So yeah, that's Emily P. Freeman.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thanks.
It's been so fun. Thank you.